Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Mem Aleph. Makirim atem oto. The Mishnah taught that after the judges question the witnesses with the 7 basic questions, then they ask them further questions, like Makirim atem oto. Do you recognize this? Is this the perpetrator who committed the crime? And so on. Tenor Banan Abraita expands on what we ask what questions we ask the witnesses. Makirim atem oto, Nochri harag, Yisrael harag, hitretem bo, kibel alav hatra'a, hitir asmo lemita, hemit betoch kedeh dibur. Do you recognize this person, the perpetrator? I think that's a simple reading, although some read this as referring to the victim. When if it was a case of murder, who did you kill? Was it a non-Jew or was it a Jew? It makes a difference in terms of the punishment. Did you warn the person before? You saw they had the knife, they were about to stab someone. Did you warn them and say, hey, that is not allowed? Kibel alav hatra'a. Did he accept it? You have to say, listen, murder is not allowed, and if you do this, this is the it's going to be capital punishment. This is the punishment that you're going to get. And the person, the perpetrator, has to say, yes, I know, and I'm going to do it anyway. So, did he accept the warning? Did he permit himself to be killed? Meaning, basically saying, I know I'm going to get capital punishment for this, and I'm doing it anyway. That's okay. I accept capital punishment upon myself for doing this act. One cannot kill him unless he accepted that upon himself. Did he commit the murder within a short time, within just a few seconds of the warning? If he stopped to give a speech like villains do, or he stopped to tie his shoe, he had to do something else, and then he did the murder, that doesn't count because maybe during that time he forgot what the warning was. And so it has to be that you give the warning. He says, yes, I know I'm going to get capital punishment. I'm going to do this anyway. And then he does the stabbing immediately within a few seconds. If you don't have all those conditions, then we don't give capital punishment. Haved avodah zara et mi avad lepeor abad lemarkulis abad b'mei abad bezibuach bekitur benisuch behishtachava'ah. That was before those extra questions was for a case of murder. If it's a question of idolatry, then you ask them, I says, I witnessed this guy worshiping idolatry. Okay, we asked him, which idol did he worship? Was he worshiping Peor, Markolis, which god? And how did he do it? Did he make a sacrifice? Did he make incense? Did he pour libation? Did he prostrate himself in front of the idol? You have to describe exactly what the act was. Amad Ula, that's the end of the Braita. Ula comments, how do we know that one needs to warn the perpetrator? The witnesses need to warn them before doing it in order to give capital punishment. We learn from the pasuk that says, if someone should take meaning have relations with his sister, and that could be his half-sister, either from his father, paternal half-sister, or maternal half-sister, and sees her nakedness. Now, in the simple reading of the Peshat, this is a euphemism. Seeing nakedness is a euphemism for doing a sexual act. However, the Gemara Eula here is taking it literally and saying if he sees her nakedness, well, seeing her nakedness, is that what the sin depends on? That's not committing the sin without an actual sexual act. So why does it say to see her nakedness? Rather, this is referring to showing the perpetrator the reason and the consequences of the action he did. So this is the source for warning. He has to know, he has to see that if he does this act, then this will be the punishment, and then he has to go and do it anyway. Im eno inyan lecharet, teneu inyan lemalkut. Now, the punishment for someone who does commit this sin of incest is karet, which happens bidei shamayim, from the hands of heaven, and therefore, actually, the bet din, the court, will not give him capital punishment here in this world anyway. So therefore, what's the difference if the witnesses give him a warning or not? Since the bet din is not giving him physical punishment anyway, it's a heavenly punishment. So therefore, this teaching cannot apply to karet, which is the normal punishment for this act. So instead, we will apply it to lashes. In fact, these come together. When in cases where someone is liable to karet, they can get lashes instead by the betin, which is a physical thing. And so, in order to give someone lashes, the person needs to be forewarned. Okay, good. So now we know that in cases of lashes, at least, there has to be a warning before the betin can punish the person. Another derivation that you need a warrant, that the witnesses need to give a warning. From the school of Chizkiah, they taught a braita when it says regarding a murderer, if someone purposefully Yazid goes against his friend and kills him with guile. So what does it mean purposefully? How do we know if it was purposeful or not? It must be that they warned him and he said, listen, you know this is not allowed and you're going to get punished for it. He says, yes, I know. So that's how we know it was purposeful. Otherwise, maybe he did it by mistake. Maybe he didn't realize that it was prohibited, or didn't realize that his act was going to kill him, whatever it is. A third derivation from the school of Rabbi Ishmael, that it says when they found the person who was gathering sticks and they brought him to Moshe to figure out what to do with him. So since mekoshesh atzim is in the present tense, it doesn't say that he was gathering sticks and he finished, but rather he's doing it right now. So that means they warned him and he was still doing it. He didn't stop, even if they told him, hey, don't you know it's Shabbat and this is not allowed? And he continued doing it. So we learn that from the tense of mekoshesh. So that's the third derivation. And last derivation, debe Rabbi Tana, al davar asher inna al iske dibur. This is capital punishment for someone who commits adultery with a betrothed na'ara me'orasa. She's a na'ara, between 12 and 12 and a half, and she is engaged, betrothed to a man, and someone is with her, so he gets capital punishment. She also does if she is willing participant. If she's forced, then she does not. And so here it says here al devad. So it says the word devad. The words. What words are we talking about? Oh, because of the words that the witnesses said before he did the act. They had to see him and say, hey, this is what you're doing here, committing adultery with this Nadam or Asa is not allowed, and here's the punishment. And he says, yes, I want to do it anyway. That's the fourth derivation. Now, why do we need four derivations for the same thing? If I only had the first derivation from the prohibition of being with one's sister, then I would only know that one needs lashes for that one needs a warning in order to give lashes. But for capital punishment, I would say, well, that's a more serious sin and a more serious punishment. So maybe we make sure to give the person capital punishment even without a warning. So I might think that, and that's why I need the ki yazid if someone does this sin on purpose regarding murder. Now, if I only had murder, the punishment for murder is beheading by a sword. And so I would think that one has to give a warning before giving the capital punishment of beheading. But maybe for stoning, which is more stringent, maybe not, because sins of stoning, like desecrating Shabbat, oh, that's more stringent. So you know what? Maybe we would kill the person even without a warning. So I only know Saif so far. But now I have two cases of Sikila. Shabbat from the Mikoshesh Etzim, and someone who commits adultery with the Na'ara HaMe'orasa, the punishment for that person is also Sikila. And so now we have two derivations for Sikila. Why do we need two for Sikila? Since that's the most severe. So then what do I need two for? And the answer is Rabbi Shimon Shimona, Tuya Nisrafin. According to Rabbi Shimon, Sikila is the second worst capital punishment. Serefa is the worst. And we don't have a source for Serefa. So by having two sources regarding Sikila, I know one's for Sikila and one's extra to teach me that Serefa also, where one requires a warning. Okay, that's good for Rabbi Shimon. L'Rabanan. Now Rabbanan, they say Sikila is the worst form. So I only really need one source to teach me Sikila, and I can learn everything else from a Kavachomer. If the worst sin and worst punishment, still you get off the hook without a warning, so too all the lesser ones also we would not give a punishment without a warning. So I could learn everything from a Kavachomer, even if I just had one thing. The rabbis would say sometimes even something that you could learn from a Kavachomer, the Torah nevertheless helps us out and goes out of its way and writes something extra so that we can know it also from that extra word or extra pasuk. Okay, that's why you have two for Sikila. But actually, why not just talk about Sikila and all the rest of the ones? The one about Saif and the one about lashes, I could learn all from that. Here, we'll give the same answer. Just like it has two Sikilas, even though I could learn, I only need just one. So too, the other matters has two Sikilas. And I don't, even though I could learn Serefa from Sikila, has two to teach me Serefa anyway, and so too down the road, even though it says there's four different derivations. Really, I'll need one, and the one for Saif and lashes also I can learn from a Kavachomer, but here too we apply that principle that sometimes the Torah goes out of its way and gives us a hand and says an extra word or an extra pasuk, even though I could learn it from a Kavachomer. Next, Hitir Asmo Lemita. The Braita that we just quoted says, we asked the witness, did the person release himself to death? Meaning, did he acknowledge, yes, I know I will get stoned for this, and that's okay. I don't mind getting stoned. I still want to do this. Then we kill him. Minalan. How do we know that he has to actually acknowledge and accept his death penalty before he does it? Because the pasuk says regarding two witnesses, right? Based on two witnesses or three witnesses, yumat hamet. It should say yumat ha'over, right? The criminal or the sinner will die. What do you mean the dead will die? He's not dead yet. When he's sinning or when he's testifying about them, he's not dead before you kill him. So what does it mean when based on two witnesses you kill the dead person? If he's already dead, then you don't have to kill him. It means that he allowed himself to die, so that when the witnesses say, "Hey, you're gonna get stoning for that," don't you know that? He says, "Yes, I know. I'm willing to be stoned." Already, when he says that, he accepted the death upon himself. So he's already called Hamit. And so from here we learn that we don't give him capital punishment unless he first acknowledges and accepts the capital punishment. Amar Rav Chanan, Edena Aram Orasa Shuzmu and Neheragin. Rav Chanan says a surprising law. He says the witnesses to a Na'ara Orasa, that's this betrothed woman who's between 12 and 12 and a half, and let's say she's consensual with some adulterer who's not her future husband. Those witnesses, if they become Edim Zomemin, they are not killed. Now this is surprising because we think they would be killed, since they're based on their testimony. If their testimony would if we would follow through with it, then we would give sikila to the adulterer and to the na'ara ma'orasa. So therefore, the main principle of edim zomin is whatever they try to do, they get that very same punishment. So they try to give these people sikila, so they should get sikila as well. So why not? Here's why. The witness says, when we came, our intention was to make her prohibited to her husband. We weren't thinking about the capital punishment. That wasn't what we were trying to do. Now it's true, it could be that as a secondary point that they didn't have in mind, they also get sikila. But they were thinking, their main point they were thinking is, no, she should be prohibited from her husband because look at what she did. and therefore, since that was not their intention, so we're not going to punish them with sikila, since their intention was not to give her sikila. Okay, now we ask, what do you mean that wasn't their intention? They gave a warning. We just said you have to give a warning. So they must have, in order to kill the Nadam or Hasa, has to be that they gave her a warning and said, listen, you're about to commit adultery with a Nadam or Hasa. Your punishment is stoning. Okay, you accept. So that means, of course, they had intention that the person would get sikila. So they should get sikila themselves. So the answer is, Rav Chanan was talking about a case where that witnesses did not give a warning. Wait a second. If they didn't give a warning, then she would not get capital punishment anyway. Rav Chanan doesn't have to teach us that, right? Anytime there's no warning, there is not a punishment. So of course the Bedim Zomin wouldn't get a punishment if they didn't give a warning. And the answer is Bisha Chaved Ava Libad Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Detanya. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Omer Chaved en Sarich Hatra Alefisha Lo Nitenatra Ela Labchin Ben Shogeg Lemezid. We're talking about a woman who is a Chavera, meaning she's knowledgeable in Torah. She's a learned woman. And we're going to follow the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Yehuda. In a Braita, he said that a Chaved, a learned man, same thing, man or woman, doesn't matter, a learned person does not require forewarning because what's the purpose of the warning? It's only to distinguish between intentional and unintentional, and because most people don't know the details of the law. So therefore, for most people, if you tell them someone is cooking on Shabbat, so you have to tell them, listen, today's Shabbat. What you're doing there is not allowed. Maybe the person doesn't know. Is he doing it without a warning? We don't know if he did it intentionally or not. Only with a warning. So then I told him, listen, this is not allowed. You're going to get sikila. He said, I know. Afal pichen, I'm going to sin anyway. Then you know it's bimezid. So you require a warning for most people where you don't know what their level of learning is. However, for a learned person, surely a chaved or a chavera, a learned man or a learned woman, knows the law and knows the punishment, and therefore, if they do it, then they're doing it b'mezid. And so that's what we're talking about. They didn't give a warning, so that we're back to our understanding here of Rav Chanan. In a case where the witnesses didn't give a warning, but she was a chavera, she will be killed, and they can still claim and say, our intention was not that she should be killed, only that she should be prohibited to her husband. Now we have a question. If they, the witnesses, are not killed because they have this claim, then how can you kill her? Because we have a principle. Havyala edut she'yata yachol hazima. V'chol edut she'yata yachol hazima la shema edut. We have a principle that this would be a testimony that cannot be falsified through hazama. And any testimony that cannot be falsified through with edim by edim mizimim coming is not acceptable as testimony. The idea here is that we want it to be falsifiable. We want the witnesses to know, listen, if you're lying, you should be careful, because if you weren't really there at that time in that place, someone might come who saw you at that time and place somewhere else, and then you're going to get the very punishment that you're trying to give. Now that's a pretty scary thing. So if someone is coming to testify, even knowing that someone might come and say you were with us in a different place, if they were lying, they would be scared and wouldn't do so. So the fact that they're coming and testifying, even though they say the time and place, is indication that they're probably telling the truth. So we can only accept as true, as trustworthy testimony that gives an exact time and place. And will have a punishment if they falsify it and someone else comes and says you weren't there. Then we can trust that they probably were really there, because otherwise they would be afraid to lie because of a punishment. So therefore, if you have a case where either, let's say, they don't say the time or don't say the place, or in a case like this where they don't get a punishment, anytime, if they're not going to get a punishment for lying, then they won't have an incentive not to lie. They won't be scared not to lie. And if they're not scared about lying, then we cannot trust the testimony. And so this is going to be a problem. So since they cannot be killed, therefore we should not kill her either, because the testimony should be invalid. That's the basic principle. In short, if you're telling me, Rav Chanan, that really, because they didn't have in mind the stoning, they only had in mind to make her prohibited from her husband, so they don't get killed. If they don't have the possibility of getting killed, if they're found to be Adim Zomamin, then we can't trust their testimony at all. So we answer, Hachinami Ka'amar, Mitoch she'neragin she'yocholim nomad lo sra ba'ala banu, afi ena nohereget, ta'avia la edut she'hi ata yachol lezima. In fact, indeed so. That is exactly what Rav Chanan was teaching in the first place, and now you're helping to fill in the whole impact of his statement. And Rav Chanan, in fact, was teaching, because the witnesses are not killed. Why are the witnesses not killed? Because they could say, we came with the intention just to make her prohibited to her husband. Anytime you have an Adam or Rasa who commits adultery, they can't continue and get married. She's also not prohibited from her adulterer. So that was our intention. We didn't want them to be with each other. We didn't have in mind. We weren't thinking about stoning. So therefore, the witnesses don't get stoned. And since the witnesses don't get stoned, therefore the Na'am Rasa and the adulterer also are not killed, because this is testimony that cannot be falsified by edim mezimin, and that is in fact what we meant. Last question about this statement: Ela bisha chavera dekamelan demiktala libad Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda hechi mashkachat la, and the answer is keshezinta vechazra vezinta. Okay, it's not the last point. There's another point coming. But now go back to the case of a woman who was learned, and we learned that according to Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, even without warning, she will be killed. So there is a case where a Na'am or Rasa can be killed. But how could she be killed if the witnesses can always come and say, oh, we only had in mind that she should be prohibited to her husband? And the answer to this is, it's talking about a case where she committed adultery, and they testified about that, and then she committed adultery again. After the first time that she committed adultery and they testified, she's already prohibited to her husband. So why would the witnesses come again and say it a second time? It must be because the second time they're saying she's already prohibited to her husband. The second time is for capital punishment, and therefore, in that case, they can't get away with saying, oh, we only had in mind to prohibit her to her husband. She's already prohibited. So why are you coming? You're coming because of capital punishment. Now, this time you have in mind capital punishment, and in that case, we would kill her. And because we would kill her, if they are found to be Edim Zoamin, we would kill the witnesses in that case. Hold on. The witnesses can say, we wanted to make her prohibited to the second adulterer. Because remember, the Na'am Rasa, if she's found to be an adulteress, she is prohibited. Let's say she gets off from capital punishment. If she's killed, then she can't marry anybody. But let's say she gets off of capital punishment for some technicality. She can no longer be with that husband that she was betrothed to. She also is not allowed to be with the adulterer. So if she commits adultery a second time with a second person, a second adulterer, so the witnesses can come and say, we wanted to make her prohibited to that guy too. So what about that? And the answer is Shezintami Boel Rishon. Oh, she committed adultery again with the same first adulterer to whom she was already prohibited. And therefore, the witnesses can come and say, oh, we wanted to make her more prohibited to a second adulterer. She was already permitted to the first adulterer and to her husband, and therefore you're not adding anything new. You must be adding capital punishment, and therefore she deserves to die, and therefore they deserve to die. Or let's say she committed adultery with one of her relatives, and she's already prohibited to one of her relatives as incest, and so they would not be adding any new prohibition, and therefore they would only be coming to give capital punishment. And then that's the case that Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda was assuming is where we actually give capital punishment. Now the last question. Why did Rav Chanan choose a case of Nadam or Rasa? All this would be true also for a regular married woman. If someone comes and says, this married woman gets adultery, the punishment is still capital punishment. It's not sikila, it's different capital punishment. But the principle is the same, that Rav Chanan would say that we shouldn't kill the witnesses, because even if they're found to be Edim Zomin, because they can say, we didn't come to give her capital punishment, and the adulterer also would get capital punishment, but rather we just wanted to make her prohibited from her husband. That's all. That's all we had in mind. And so, therefore, we cannot give capital punishment. Why? So, why didn't he pick that case? So, in ela filu hai delaya tabad tute yuchalin lamad lo sra al ba'ala banu. In fact, Rav Chanan could have brought that example, and his principle would also apply to someone who was fully married. But he wanted to bring a bigger chidush, that even this betrothed woman, who has not yet begun to live with her groom, with her future husband, and nevertheless, even though they haven't even started to live together, we accept the claim of the witnesses when they say we wanted to make them prohibited. You might think that they can only say we wanted to make them prohibited when they're married and already living with each other. So now you're introducing a prohibition, so they have to separate. But in the case of Na'adam Morasa, they're not yet living together. So maybe we'll say, well, they're not even living together. That's what you had in mind, to separate them in the future? So we might think that that claim would not be valid. And so therefore Rav Chanan is using this example to teach, yes, it's valid here. In this case also, they could say, we didn't mean to kill her, we just meant to make her prohibited, even for the future, or eventually when they do nisu'in. Amar Rav Chisda, echad omer b'sayif harago, v'echad omer ba'ariran harago, en ze nachon. Echad omer kelav shechorin, v'echad omer kelav lebanim, hare ze nachon. Rav Chisda teaches, if one of the witnesses said, I saw this guy murder, and we say, what kind of weapon? He says, saif, a regular sword. And the other witness says, I saw an ariran, a different kind of sword, like a curved sword. So even though they're both swords, and they both say that it's this guy who killed that guy, nevertheless, this is not called congruent, right? It says, emet, nachon hadavar. It has to be corresponding, it has to be the same. And if they make a mistake on the murder weapon, that they say contradictory things, we throw out the testimony. However, if one person says the murderer was wearing black, and the other one says the murderer was wearing white, then that's okay. We accept it because this is not one of the main questions. This is not essential to the murder. If it's the murder weapon, they must be seeing them. If they must be to see the murder, they have to be seeing the murder weapon and concentrating on it. So surely you'd remember what kind of weapon it was. If you don't remember a detail like what were they wearing, so then that's some people don't pay attention to what people are wearing, right? Go to after a party. Did you see what that person was wearing? My wife asked me. I said, no, I have no idea, right? So she pays attention to that. I have no idea what people are wearing. I'm not going to remember that. So a guy's concentrating on the murder. He's not paying attention to the what they're wearing, so they could make a mistake. One says black, one says white. That's acceptable. A challenge against Rav Chisda from a baraita. Nachon sheyeh nachon. Echad omer b'sayf harago, v'echad omer ba'ariran harago, echad omer kelav shechorin, v'echad omer kelav levanim, en ze nachon. So according to this baraita, we learn from the pasuk, emet nachon hadavar. The testimony has to be congruent, and gives two examples. If one says it was straight sword, and the other one says it was a curved sword, no good. It's not congruent. And if one says that the murderer's clothing was black, and the other one says the murderer's clothing was white, that's not congruent. So you see, this baraita directly contradicts Rav Chisda. They agree regarding the sword example, but they disagree regarding the colored clothing. According to this, making a mistake in the color of the clothing of the murderer is a problem, and we would throw out the testimony. The answer is Tirgema Rav Chisda besudar shechanako bo tahainu saif variran. So Rav Chisda interprets this baraita as referring to a case where the clothing is not what the murderer was wearing, but the clothing is the murder weapon. For example, if someone strangled someone else with a handkerchief, and the question is, what color was that handkerchief? Was it black or white? That would be the same as making a mistake between a straight sword and a curved sword. Since it's the murder weapon, you have to know exactly what it was. And that's why in this baraita, we say it's no good if there was a contradiction. But indeed, if it was only about what color the person is wearing, that's not essential to the act of murder, and a contradiction there would be acceptable. Tashema, echad omer sandalav shechorin v'echad omer sandalav lebanim, and ze nachon. So another challenge from a baraita: if one of the witnesses says that the sandals of the murderer were black, and the other says no, he was wearing white sandals, then that's not congruent, and we don't accept the testimony. That's a challenge against Rav Chisda, who said that the color of the clothing doesn't matter. There too, we're talking about where the sandal was the murder weapon. The murderer was smashing, kicking the victim with a sandal. Death by sandal, and therefore that would be the same as not knowing the type of sword that it is. Tashema Maseu Badak ben Zakai beukse te'ena Amar Rami bar Hama kegon she'akas te'ena b'Shabbat de'ala ka miktil. Another challenge against Rav Chisda. And we have a story from the Mishnah that Ben Zakai, that's Yochanan ben Zakai, he checked out and asked the witnesses about the stems of the figs. In other words, there was some murder that happened. Where did it happen? Over there in that garden, under the fig tree. That's where he murdered him. And Yochanan ben Zakai asked the witness, tell me about the size of the stems of the fig. Was it long or was it short? And they disagreed, and he said, okay, this testimony is no good. So that is certainly an incidental point, right? Like the color of the clothing. And yet it says that if they contradicted, we don't accept the testimony. That's not what Rav Chisda said. And the answer by Rami bar Chama is, that case is talking about someone who plucked a fig off of the tree on Shabbat. So we're talking about violation of Shabbat, which is capital punishment of Sikila, and so that was actually the item of the crime. So this is an essential fact. It's not just a background. It happened to be under a fig tree, so it looked like this or looked like that. He plucked a fig, so it's appropriate about when Zakai says, well, what kind of fig was it? Describe the fig, the color of the fig. Tell me the shape of the stem of the fig, because since it's not a case of murder, it's not the murder weapon, it was the item by which Shabbat was violated. So it was an essential part of the sin, and therefore, since they contradicted, we kick him out. Hold on, there's a braita that's describing this case of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai, and in this braita gives the conversation where the witness said, I saw the murder happen under a fig tree. So you see that it was a murder case, not a Shabbat violation case. So now what are you going to say? Ela Rami bar Chama kegon sheshippedo bichur shel te'ena. Rami bar Chama, who, by the way, we've seen many times, he's famous for his sometimes outlandish questions, right, with very theoretical questions that sometimes annoy his colleagues. And here, it sounds outlandish, I know, but this would be typical for Rami bar Chama. It's talking about when someone stabbed someone else with the branch of a fig tree, which could happen. That's a murder by fig tree branch. And so, since that was the murder weapon, that makes sense. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakai asked him, what kind of fig tree was it? To describe the figs, describe the stems of the figs, because he used that very stem, or the branch connected to the stem, to commit the murder, and therefore, since they contradicted each other, he threw out their testimony. Tashema amar lehen te'ena zo o kaseh hadakin o kaseh hagasin te'enim shechorot te'enim levanot ela amar Rav Yosef ben Zakai lotib inish shane ben Zakai de bidikot kahakirot mashvile. A challenge to this answer, we have a baraita that further describes the conversation between Yochanan ben Zakai and the witnesses, and here it says that Yochanan ben Zakai asked them about the fig tree, about its stems. Are they thin or thick? And the figs, are they black or white? What we see from here is that he was asking about the figs themselves, not about the branch. And the murder weapon was the branch, not the figs, and therefore this would be background material, not essential material of the actual murder weapon. And so what we see is that this would be difficult to reconcile with the original statement of Rav Chisda, and so we answer that this is only the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai. Rav Yosef explains, right? Are you asking against Rav Chisda from the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai is different because he equated bidikot to be like chakirot. Just like chakirot, you have to ask these questions, and the 7 basic questions. And any contradiction is we throw out the testimony. He treated bidikot in the same way. But that was special to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai. He went out of his way to be super lenient to the defendant and get everybody off the hook. But that's not the standard majority opinion, and therefore Rav Chisda was not following Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. He was following the majority opinion that said that it does make a distinction between chakirot and bedikot, and so therefore for chakirot, if it's an essential question, which means not only the 7 questions, but also a question about the crime or sin itself. If it's directly involving that, like the murder weapon, then they also have to be congruent. But if it's things about what the person was wearing or other things in the background, there, that's what Rav Chisda was explaining, that a contradiction is still acceptable, and we can still accept the testimony. Next, we ask about the story mentioned in the Mishnah, Man ben Zakkai. Who is this ben Zakkai who asked the witnesses about the stems of the figs? Ilema Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, mi haba beSanhedri. Is it referring to the famous Rabbi Yochanan, or sometimes Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, the famous Tana, who was snuck out of the walls of Jerusalem during the siege in a coffin because he wanted to make a deal with the Romans and so on? If it was him, which seems to be him because ben Zakkai, here's the problem. Was he ever on the Sanhedrin in a case, judging a capital case? We learned that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai lived 120 years, parallel to Moshe Rabbeinu, and it's a way of saying how significant he was. 40 shana asak b'rakmatya. 40 shana lamad. 40 shana limed. For 40 years he was in business. For 40 years he was learning, and for 40 years he was teaching. He was a leader. So it would be during the last 40 years that he would be a judge, if in fact he was a judge in a capital case. We also learn in the Braita that 40 years before the destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash, it was destroyed in the year 70. So this would take us back to the year 30. The Sanhedrin was exiled, and no longer was it in the temple courtyard in the chamber of hewn stone, Lishkat HaGazit, but rather it had to move. The Bet HaMikdash was still up. This 40 years before it was destroyed, but it moved to the store area. This is referring to this area all around the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount area. There were stalls for stores where you could buy food to eat. You could buy maybe some, pigeons or wine for libations, for sacrifices. You could buy maybe some, a gift shop. You could buy those little wooden camels, right? Who knows? Whatever they were selling there. This was a place where people congregated. You had to be tahor to go up there, but otherwise, walking around. This is not in the Bet HaMikdash. This is outside the Bet HaMikdash, all around the very big area that was up there, where some people still go up there today. And so it had to move from the Bet HaMikdash courtyard itself to the area around it. And from that time on, they did not have the authority to judge capital cases. Yitzchak bar Abudmi says, from that time on, when they were exiled, they no longer judged cases of fines. We ask, cases of fines? What are you talking about? Cases of fines are easy. In Eretz Yisrael, they judge cases of fines even for hundreds of years afterwards. So that's not what he means. Rather, he means they did not judge capital cases. So in early times, the Sanhedrin could judge capital cases, but when they were no longer in the Lishkat HaGazit, they stopped judging capital cases, either on their own because they didn't have the right authority and not being in the proper place. You could also explain that because of the Romans. The Romans did not allow the Jews to give people capital punishment. Either way, they weren't giving capital punishment from the year 30 and on. Utnan, we have a list of Mishnayot and Sukkot where we see that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a great leader after the destruction. He was making all kinds of takanot regarding lulav and other matters. So we see he was acting as limed the last 40 years of his life. Part of it, at least part of it, was after the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash, which means that he started being a leader, the 40 years of Limed, only after the year 30. And by that time, the Sanhedrin was not judging capital cases. And so here's the question, which Ben Zakkai is this that was judging a capital case and asked the witnesses all about the figs? It couldn't have been the famous Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, because he was only active as a teacher, as a judge, after the year 30, because part of the 40 years has to overlap after 70 CE, and therefore he could not have been judging capital cases before 30 CE. Ela ben Zakkai de Alma. It must be a different Ben Zakkai, someone named Ben Zakkai. He must have been a great sage himself, because he was a Dayan on the Sanhedrin, so he was great, but not the famous Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Hachinam istabra disakadatach Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai kadi le Rabbi ben Zakkai, and that makes sense, because if it was the famous Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, would you call him Ben Zakkai without a title? Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai actually might have been the first person to have a title, Rabban or Rabbi. If you think of all the early sages during the time of the second Bet HaMikdash, and you can find them all in the beginning of Pirkei Avot, you have Hillel and Shammai and Shemaiah, Avtalyon, Yosef ben Yoezer, Antignos, Ish Socho, but you notice that none of them have a title, Rabbi. Although they were, of course, the greatest of sages, that title was not in use yet as a title for a specific authority. And so it's really only after, once the Bet HaMikdash is destroyed, that this title of Rabbi or Rabban comes into use. And so, anyway, we ask now, if it was the famous Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, why would in the Mishnah, why would the story in the Mishnah refer to him as just Ben Zakkai? V'atanya ma'aseu badak Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai b'uksetenim. And now we reject this, and we say, no, it's got to be the same person. Ben Zakkai here must refer to the famous one, because there's a Baraita that repeats the same story, and here it says, there was a story, and the Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai checked out the witnesses regarding the stems of the figs. So according to this, it is the famous Rabban. Rather, must be that the story in fact happened before 30 CE, when he was a student sitting before his teachers. And we learned, remember, that when there's a capital case, the judges say, does anybody here, any of the students, have any arguments to offer for innocence? And he was a student. He was sitting somewhere, probably in the front row. And he said, I have an idea. Let's ask them questions about the fig tree. So, good idea. So come up here. And he was elevated to sit with the judges for this case, because he gave a good idea. And so therefore, he said something, and it made sense to them. And therefore, they established it in his name, right? And therefore, even though he was not one of the official judges of the Sanhedrin, not yet, still, because he suggested that argument that they used, in fact, to get the person off the hook, so they remembered it in his name. But yet, at that time, he was only a student, so they called him just Ben Zakkai. He didn't have semicha yet. Ki hava lamad Ben Zakkai hava kadile. Ki talmid yoshev lifnei rabo. Ki hava limed hava kadile Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. And so his name was different. When he was just a student, he was called Ben Zakkai, because he was a student sitting before his masters. When he was teaching, then he used the title Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabban is even greater than Rabbi. Rabban, he was the head, like he was like the Nasi, the supreme, the chief rabbi. Ki kari le ben Zakkai al shem de meikara, v'chi kari le Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai al shem de hashta. And so even later on, in the Mishnah, when it says Ben Zakkai adjudicated this case, it was calling him his original name, Ben Zakkai, as he was when he was a student, when that original story happened. Whereas in the Braita that says Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai, it was updating his name based on what he's called now. I mean, this happens if you're referring to a story of someone that you know before they got semicha. So when you're talking about the story, you can either tell the story as with his person's original name, because that was their name when the story happened. Or, since now they're a rabbi, you can update the name, even though they didn't have semicha yet at that point. Okay, Mishnah goes on and says, Ma ben hakirot. The Mishnah says, what's the difference between hakirot and bedikot? And the answer is, in the case of the basic questions, if the one witness says, I don't know, then we avoid their testimony. Whereas in the case of bidikot, the extra questions, there, if one of the witnesses says, I don't know, or even if both of them say, I don't know, that's okay. They don't have to know all the details. I imagine if they keep saying, I don't know to any of them, I'm not sure what we would do at that point. But here, at least for some of them, they can say, pass, I'm not sure. Now we ask, May afilu shenaim omerim pishita, ki amar echad eni yodea edutan kayemet, ki amri be tere name edutan kayemet. Why does it say, even if two witnesses say we don't know, still the testimony is acceptable? What do you mean even? It should be the opposite. If when one says I don't know and the other one said black, we said what color was the clothing, and there we say it's okay. If they both say I don't know, at least they're in agreement. The point is, like if something was memorable and one person remembered it, then it would kind of make sense that the other person should remember it. Right? If the person was wearing neon orange, so that's something memorable. One says neon orange, the other one says I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? This guy remembered. How come you didn't remember? And if there we accept the testimony anyway, then all the more so you should accept the testimony when both of them say I don't know, because it was something just not memorable. They were wearing just a plain white shirt, so there was nothing that stood out. So what do you mean afilu? Even if both of them say I don't know regarding the bidikot, that we accept it. Amar Rav Sheshat aresha ka'eh. Rav Sheshat is quite a rereading here, and he says this is actually talking about the earlier case. V'hachi kamar b'chakirot. Afilu shenaim omrim yadanu v'chad omer eni yodea dutan betela keman kerebi Akiva demakish shelosha lishnayim. In fact, it's talking about the Resha, the earlier section that was about the chakirot, the 7 basic questions. This line, even though it comes later, is referring back to that, and it's assuming a case of 3 witnesses and saying as follows: even if 2 witnesses, we know exactly the place that it was, and one says, I don't know the place that it was, still the testimony is canceled. Now you might think it would be okay, because you still have 2 witnesses that have the answers to all 7. 2 witnesses that say we know the time, we know the place. Only the 3rd witness, who we didn't need anyway, because 2 would be sufficient. Nevertheless, if the 3rd one says I don't know, then it's canceled. That's the afilu, right? Even 2 witnesses that say we know. Now you have to change some words around here, because really the Mishnah says even if 2 said we don't know. Okay, but he means even if 2 said we know, and after Eden, and 1 said I don't know, then it's canceled. The Mishnah actually say it's okay, right? Because in the wording of the Mishnah, if it's both say we don't know, and we about the bidikot, then it's okay. Rav Sheshat is now moving it up, making it refer to something earlier, and he actually has to change some of the words. Anyway, assuming this is the language, Keman, who would this follow? It would follow to be Akiva, who says 3 is the same as 2. Why does the pasuk say 3 and 2? Al pi shenaim edim o shelosha edim. Why have to mention 2 and 3? If 2 is sufficient, why bother mentioning 3? And Rabbi Akiva's answer to that is, it's showing that 3 is like 2. Just like if you have 2 witnesses, both of them have to answer all the basic questions and have to line up. So too, if you have 3, even though you didn't need 3 to come in, and if the 3rd guy stayed home, that would have been okay. But if the 3rd guy does come to court and testify, then the 3rd guy has to answer all the questions and be in agreement with the first 2 regarding the chakirot. And so this would follow Rabbi Akiva, that even if 2 say we know and give the right answer, and 1 says I don't know, it's no good. That's Rav Sheshat's rereading of the Mishnah. Amar Rava, edutan kayemet katan. Rava says, yeah, but the words of the Mishnah don't say that. So you can't just go and make a big change like that. Rather, the Mishnah says that even if 2 witnesses say we don't know, it's valid. So you can't read this into mean the opposite. Ela amar Rava hachika amar afilu b'chakirot shenaim omrim yadanu v'echad omer eni yodea edutan kayemet keman delo k'Rabbi Akiva. So even though Rava is arguing against Rav Sheshat, he does pick up on some of the answer of Rav Sheshat and assumes that there's 3 witnesses, and he says this is what it means, and it's referring to the chakirot, the basic questions. And he says like this: even in the chakirot, even the basic questions, as long as 2 say we know where it happened and what and when it happened, and they give the answer and the answers agree with each other, and one says, I don't know, nevertheless, it's okay. Not only in Bidikot is okay, of course in Bidikot it's okay, because in Bidikot, even if there's only two witnesses and one says, I don't know, or both say, I don't know, that's fine. You could not know in Bidikot. Not only that, the even is saying, even in Chakirot, if you have two, then they have to say and they have to agree. If you have three, as long as two out of the three answer the question correctly, and the third one says, I don't know, that's okay. And who does this follow? Keman, de la Rabbi Akiva. And in fact, our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Akiva. The other opinion against Rabbi Akiva says that we compare 2 and 3 for other reasons. And in fact, if you have 3 and one says, I don't know, so we can just ignore the third because we have 2. And the third guy could have stayed home, and we can rely on the 2 only. Rav Kana v'Rav Safra tanu Sanhedrin be'Rabbah. Paga behu Rami bar Chama. Ma lehu mayamritu ba beSanhedrin de be'Rabbah. We have a story about Rav Kana and Rav Safra. They were learning the laws and the Mishnayot of Masechet Sanhedrin in the school or the house of Rabbah. And then Rami bar Chama met them. Again, Rami bar Chama was the one who asks tough questions and theoretical cases. And so Rami bar Chama saw them and he said, what did you learn about Masechet Sanhedrin in the house of Rabbah? Right? Tell me some chidush. Tell me something about it. Amri le umay amrinan ba beSanhedrin giredata umay kashelach. Before you ask about what we learned special in the school of Rabbah, why don't you ask us a basic question? Ask us a question about Sanhedrin, plain old Sanhedrin, that we have learned even before we came to the school of Rabbah. Or what's your question? In other words, like, are you asking something specific? You just want us to talk about something? Right? What are you looking for? Amar lehu, meha deketane, ma ben chakirot bedikot chakirot echad omer eni yodea, edutan betela, bedikot amar echad eni yodea, vafilu shenam omrim en anu yod'im, edutan kayemet. Rabbi Chama says, I have a difficulty with the Mishnah that teaches, our Mishnah, what's the difference between chakirot and bedikot? Chakirot, the simple questions, the fundamental questions. If one of them says, I don't know, we throw it out. Whereas with bedikot, the extra questions, if one says, I don't know, or even if both witnesses we don't know, then their testimony is valid. Here's the question. Since both of them are deoraita, we learned the Pisukim before, from which we learn these questions. So since they're all deoraita, therefore, what is the difference? But why should there be a difference between chakirot and bedikot? Since they're both on the deoraita level, they need to be asked. Therefore, they should have the same requirements. And if you say, I don't know, it should be the same law for both of them. What's the basis of this distinction? Amri le hachi hashta b'chakirot amar echad eni yodea edutan betela daviala edut sheyata yachol hazima bedikot amar echad mehen eni yodea edutan kayemet edut sheyata yachol hazima hu. And so they answer him, oh, well, you're comparing these two types of questions? They're completely different. Regarding chakirot, the 7 basic questions, if one of them says, I don't know, then the testimony is invalid because that would be testimony that cannot be falsified by edim mizimin. And we can't trust that, right? We need to know that the witnesses know that if they lie, then someone else can come and say, you are with us in another place, and they would get the same very punishment that they are trying to give. So that threat has to be there in order to be a deterrent for them to lie. If they don't say where and when it happened, then nobody can ever come and be edim mizimin and say, you were with us somewhere else on that day, because they never said where and when they were testifying about. So that is absolutely necessary. Whereas bedikot, if one of them says, I don't know, that's okay, because it's still testimony that can be falsified, because the fact that it's black, wearing black or wearing white, that doesn't matter to the edim mizimim. In order to be edim zomin, all we need to know is where and when they claim to have been, and that way someone else can come and say you were not there. That's the essence of edim zomamin, and that is the distinction between them. Amar lehu yachi amri tuba amri tuba. Rabbi Chama says, that's what you learned about it? You learned something good about it. That is correct. I'm in total agreement. Thank you for answering so nicely. Amri le metibute demod amrinan bar tuba menezi hute demod la amrinan ba vela hada. And so they thanked him for being gracious to them. It seems that they were a bit intimidated from Rami Bar Chama. He's going to ask them a curveball or challenge their answer. So they said, it's because of your goodness and your desire to hear us out. That's why we said something good. But if you would have rebuked us, then we would not be able to say anything before you. And so that was a nice conversation. Finally, Ehad Omed. The Mishnah says that if one of the witnesses says that we saw this happen on I saw it happen on the 2nd of the month, and the other said it was on the 3rd of the month, we still accept their testimony because they might legitimately be off by one, because one thinks that the previous month was 30 days, and one thinks the previous month was 29 days, and they didn't get the message yet. Eventually they'll get the message about it, but it could be that they did not yet learn it. So it's actually on purpose that the Mishnah is using the example of the 2nd and 3rd of the month. The question is, until when will that be true for? What if one of them says the 25th of the month and one says 26th of the month? Do we still expect that they won't have found out when the proper Rosh Chodesh was? Right after Rosh Chodesh, it takes time for the word to get out, but not that long. So that's what we ask. Ad kama, until when during the month will we accept a discrepancy of one day between the witnesses? Amar Rabbi Acha bar Hanina, Amar Rabbi Aseh, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ad rubo shel Chodesh. And so Rabbi Yochanan says, until the majority of the month has passed. If you're still in the first half of the month, and you're off by one day, that's okay. But when the majority of the month has passed and you're already in the second half of the month, that most people would have heard that, that last month was chased, or last month was maleh. And then, therefore, they should agree exactly on the date. If they disagree on the date in the second half of the month, then we throw out the testimony, even though it's only one day off. Amar Rava, af anana mitanena, echad omer b'shlosha v'echad omer b'chamisha, dutan betela. Ve'amay nema sheze yodea b'shnei iburin, v'ze eno yodea b'shnei iburin, elala mishum de beruba yada. Rava says, I have a braita to back up the answer of Rabbi Yochanan, because the braita says, if one of them says it's the 3rd day of the month, and the other one says the 5th day of the month, that's too far off. And so we reject their testimony. And now you could ask why. Maybe you could say one knows that both of the previous months, or he thinks that both of the previous months were me'ubad, were 30 days each, and the other guy doesn't know, and he thinks that both of them were chaser. So you could legitimately be off by 2 days if they haven't heard about the previous month, the one just now and the one before that. And so why don't we say that? The answer is we don't say that because a person will find out by the end of the month whether the beginning of that month, which day Rosh Chodesh it was. In other words, a whole month doesn't go by before we can assume that people know whether that Rosh Chodesh was on the day they thought, or a day before, or a day after they thought it was. And so we can prove from here that, in fact, since a whole month doesn't go by, so when does a person find out? Okay, generally, by the middle of the month, right? Once a majority of the month passes, then they already know, because they're already going to know by the next Rosh Chodesh. So isn't that a good proof? I would say not necessarily a good proof. Le'olam emalach beruba nami layada ubeshipura yada bechad shipura amar detayeh b'tere shipure la amar detayeh. No, it could be that people don't necessarily usually find out when Rosh Chodesh was, even by the end of the month. It could be the whole month will go by, right? 29 days, 30 days will go by without a person having found out when Rosh Chodesh really was, because they might have missed the shofar. The Beit Din would blow the shofar when there was Rosh Chodesh, and you can miss one of them. However, we assume that many people may very well miss one of them and therefore be off by one day. But no, they're not going to miss 2 shofars. That would be very unusual. And so therefore, that's why you can't be off by 2 days, because to be off by 2 days means you missed the shofar of the previous month, and you missed the shofar of this month that you're in, that just started, however, a few days ago. That doesn't happen. You're going to know you're not going to miss 2 in a row. Most people don't miss 2 in a row. Therefore, we can assume that if someone makes a mistake of 1 day, all month long, that's okay, because there are many people that never find out when Rosh Chodesh was from Rosh Chodesh until the end of the month. However, when the next month comes, if they didn't know when Rosh Chodesh was the month before, they will know the next month, because they'll hear the shofar the next month, and therefore they're not going to continue the mistake of last month this month. So therefore, yes, a person may be one off all month long, but they're not going to be 2 days off. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen ve'amen.